Welcome to the Build American, Buy American training, or BABA. This training has been sponsored by San Mateo County Department of Housing. The training has been recorded and delivered in October 2025, and I want to note that some of the resources and information have changed since BABA's first implementation. To begin this presentation, we're going to do a quick review of what BABA is and the history of how we got to today. BABA is a preference under the Regulation 2 CFR Part 184 to include American-made products and federally funded projects. BABA is also known by the Buy American Preference, or BAP. For the purpose of this training, these acronyms BABA and BAP can be used interchangeably. BABA requires that all iron and steel construction materials and manufacture projects used in federally funded infrastructure projects are produced in the U.S. The county must work closely with its funding recipients, developers, and contractors to ensure these products used in its HUD-funded infrastructure projects are produced in the U.S. BABA began with its passage in November 2021 under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. OMB revised 2 CFR Part 200.322 to include the BABA or BAP preference. So what does this mean for people that don't speak federal speak? It means that the Office of Management and Budget updated the uniform administrative requirements followed by many of the communities across the U.S., including the county, to include the BABA preference. HUD truly began rolling out its guidance in early 2023. It began by using a phased implementation waiver for its covered programs. HUD provided guidance, including some contractual language, which you'll see in this training, and began requiring projects to document the use of waivers in compliance with the BABA regulations. I just want to note at this point that some of the information available on HUD's website has either been wiped or is no longer available. However, information on the HUD exchange is still readily available. The phased waivers HUD utilized at the beginning of BABA implementation, for the most part, are over. However, I did want to include this slide to discuss how some of these phased waivers could still impact projects today. The phased implementation waiver HUD used for BABA was based on the funding resource and the products to be included in the project. Most of these older funding resources have already been spent by the county. However, there is an exception. The phased waiver was based on when the county signed its grant agreements for these funding resources. So it was based on a signature on an agreement between the county and HUD. The Home ARP grant agreement was signed prior to the implementation of the phased waivers and how they applied to the home program. So what does this mean? It means county specific, BABA would not apply to the home ARP program. If there's any confusion, confirm with your HCD specialist about BABA's applicability. So now that we've gone over a bit of the history of BABA, I want to review the applicability of BABA. Some of the terms are confusing, so I want to offer some clarification. HUD defines a project using the same term and definition under the environmental review regulations or the NEPA rules. A project is all related activities to accomplish a specific objective. Like a NEPA project, the county or the funding recipient cannot subdivide a project for the purpose of applying one of the general waivers we'll talk about later in the training. As a quick note, there's some additional guidance from the Office of Management and Budget on a waiver called M-24-02. And it states that projects with a private quote-unquote quality are not subject to BABA. As a result, projects consisting solely of the purchase, construction, or improvement of a private home for personal use, for example, would not constitute a public infrastructure project and therefore not be subject to the BABA regulations. What does this mean? Generally, owner-occupied repair projects are not subject to BABA. The next place where I have found confusion is on the term infrastructure. Generally, we have thought of infrastructure projects as streets, sidewalks, sewers, and things of the like. But that's different under BABA. The BABA definition of infrastructure project is included on this slide. I'd like to call attention to the bolded text, where housing construction and rehabilitation are also included in the BABA definition of an infrastructure project. Public facility and homeless shelter renovation and construction are also included in an infrastructure project under BABA. The next place where I find confusion is on the applicable programs. CPD Notice 23-12 includes all of the covered programs under HUD and its community and planning development programs. However, this slide includes the programs likely to be encountered by HCD's programs and projects. Again, I want to call attention to Home ARP. It's listed on the list of covered programs. However, many communities, including San Mateo County, signed their grant agreements with HUD prior to the phase implementation waivers, and therefore it's not covered under BABA using that phased implementation waiver. BABA does not apply to emergency response funding. So for the purpose of the county, any CARES Act funding related is not covered under BABA. BABA regulations outline the covered materials in a project. Covered materials are the materials in a project that must be made in the United States. Covered materials are broken down into 3 different categories listed on this slide. Iron and steel means articles, materials, or supplies that consist wholly or predominantly of iron or steel or a combination of both. HUD considers the terms predominantly and primarily to be interchangeable. Predominantly means the cost of the iron and steel content exceeds 50% of the total cost of all of the item's components. I've included links to facts page on the HUD Exchange website to find a listing of the construction materials and manufactured products. There's a long list for each of these. These links will give you the specific materials under each of these 2 categories. This slide goes further into the 3 different types of materials. BABA outlines what it means for each category of materials to be manufactured in the United States. For example, in the case of iron and steel products, to be considered manufactured or produced in the United States under BABA, all manufacturing processes, from the initial melting stage through the application of coatings, have to have occurred in the U.S. So now we know what a project is, what an infrastructure project is. and what materials are covered, now we need to know how to document what it means to be compliant. The next few slides will discuss documenting compliance, whether BABA applies or the project is using a waiver. This slide lists the steps you should follow when implementing BABA. First, determine whether the project must comply with BABA. Meaning, does it apply to the project? And if it does, how so? Are the funds being used for an infrastructure project? Does the project use funds from a covered CPD program? Does the project use products subject to BABA or BOP? Were CPD funds obligated on or after the effective date? Most likely, if you're using county funding, the answer to that last question will be yes. The second step is to determine whether a general waiver will apply. Is the project covered in whole or part by any of the general waivers? Or, as lastly, determine could the project qualify for a project-specific waiver. This slide is more for an HCD specialist, but as a funding recipient, you may want to have a copy of this toolkit or this form in your files. HUD's created what they call an optional BAP checklist, but for the purpose of the county, they will be using them for all of their projects going forward. The checklist walks staff through the applicability of BABA and the current HUD general waivers. This checklist or document will serve as documentation of the use of a general waiver. Following best practices, the county and the funding recipient and/or developer should have a pre-award meeting to discuss the applicability of BABA and walking through this checklist. The meeting can be used to discuss the covered materials and which will be a challenge to source. The last page of the checklist shown here on the slide will identify and determine if the county will be submitting for a project-specific waiver. This slide includes some contracting and bidding language to be used for BABA-covered projects. This language was provided to me by HUD in a training in early 2023. So I recommend that you have your own legal counsel review the language prior to its use. HUD has created what they call an optional Buy American Preference certification, which can be used by contractors to certify that the materials utilized in the project meet the preference and are produced in the United States. The county is going to require funding recipients and/or borrowers to utilize this form. It also requires backup documentation. So the question becomes, once I complete the form and sign and certify that the products were made in the United States, what does the backup documentation look like? Well, this slide lists some examples, which can include copies of labels indicating the product was made in the US, copies of the product description or technical specs that provide detail the covered materials were produced in the US, other certificate or documents from the manufacturer demonstrating the covered materials comply with BABA. In the event you're unable to locate that optional HUD certification, this slide includes a list of the items to be provided to document compliance with BABA. This should be provided to the funding recipient on the funding recipient's letterhead or the contractor's letterhead to the county. So now that we've talked about the history and the compliance, I want to discuss a few waivers that may be applicable to current projects. I want to note this needs to be confirmed with the county via the HUD-BAP checklist. Both the HCD specialist and the funding recipient should have a copy for their files to document use of a current HUD general waiver. This slide lists 3 of the HUD general waivers that may be used by the county. These waivers are effective from November 23rd, 2022 for a period of 5 years ending on November 23rd, 2027. The county and funding recipient should document the use of one of these general waivers using the HUD-BAP checklist in their project files. The first waiver is an exigent circumstance waiver. This waiver applies when there is an urgent need by a grantee, the county, to immediately complete an infrastructure project because of exigent circumstances or a threat to life, safety, or property of residents in the community. There's a small grants waiver. BABA requirements do not apply to infrastructure projects where the total cost is equal to or less than the current simplified acquisition threshold, which today sits at $250,000. I want to note this small project waiver applies to projects and the total cost for that project. So it's not limited to just federal funds in the project or county funds in the project. The total cost of the project must be below that $250,000. The third waiver is the de minimis waiver. BABA requirements do not apply for a de minimis portion of an infrastructure project, meaning a cumulative total of no more than 5% of the total cost of iron, steel, manufactured products, and construction materials up to a maximum of $1 million. There is one other waiver that you may find on the HUD Exchange website, but likely it will not apply to the county. And this is a tribal waiver. This waiver is effective for tribal recipients through September 30th, 2024. HUD issued a public interest waiver for BAP as it applies to tribal recipients to allow time for the HUD to consult with tribally designated housing entities and other tribal entities on how to apply for BAP. While the exigent and small grants waivers are self-explanatory, I want to provide more guidance on the de minimis waiver. This slide is an example of the use of the de minimis waiver. In my example, the county funds a public facility improvement project that has a total budget of $500,000 to replace a roof, which includes some iron, steel, manufactured products, and construction materials. The contractor notes at the pre-award meeting that they are unable to find all American-made materials. 5% of the total budget is $50,000, so it's below the $1 million threshold. The waiver allows a contractor to purchase up to $50,000 of materials and products from unknown origins and only documenting the rest of the materials from American-made manufacture. In this example, there's flexibility for a percent of the project to purchase materials from unknown origin. So now that we reviewed general waivers, which are a preference to use, we'll take some time to talk about project-specific waivers. Project-specific waivers don't have a time limit. However, they do require a lot of documentation and work to apply for, and require working with the county and the local HUD office to submit a waiver request to HUD Washington. There are 3 different reasons that HUD will accept a project waiver request. The first is non-availability. The material is simply not produced in the U.S. in the quantity or quality required. Unreasonable cost is the second reason. The material costs will increase the project by more than 25%. Public interest. Applying the preference would be inconsistent with the public interest. Before applying for a project-specific waiver, consider a few things. Priority should be to qualify the project under one of the HUD program general waivers. A project waiver can take months, and no project activity could take place prior to getting that waiver. Third, you must include market research and document information and the need for a project-specific waiver. Grantees or the county must apply for the project waiver. A contractor or a funding recipient does not apply for the waiver directly. The county must also notify their local CPD representative that they are submitting for a HUD waiver. Other things to consider includes if there are other federal resources in the project. If multiple federal agencies are involved, because this is a cross-cutting regulation, a project waiver must be approved by all federal agencies involved. To do this, a waiver must be submitted to the federal agency with the most funding in the project. This is called the cognizant agency. The cognizant agency will coordinate the project-specific waiver with all of the other federal agencies involved. However, they cannot issue the waiver. They can only coordinate the waiver. HUD has a specific website to apply for a project waiver noted here on this slide. As I mentioned earlier in the training, a lot of the links are missing or have been wiped from HUD's website. But I wanted to pull as much as I could for this presentation while those links are still live as of September 1st, 2025. The next few slides include some of those links. The first is the HUD BABA landing page. The HUD Exchange has kept that. I've also referenced a few of the memos in this CPD memos and an OMB memo in this training. Those are still available as well. I've included links on this slide and the next slide to those memos. I've also included an FAQ page on BABA. This last memo, the OMB memo, is the memo that talks about private qualities and how BABA does not apply to those types of projects. If you're still wanting more training or a HUD-specific training on BABA, this slide is a link to a HUD training on its implementation. Lastly, HUD has provided a reference to a consultant partnership that can help projects find covered materials and suppliers for projects. Using this resource is helpful when applying for a project-specific waiver. I want to note there may be a cost associated with using this resource, but if you're applying for a project-specific waiver, it's helpful if you've used the HUD partnership to document the unavailability or the cost of materials. This concludes our training today. Thank you for attending.